Conditions May Apply by CinnamonPinecones. Read by Distracted by Books. Chapter 56. Freeze, Ray, Panic. Weeks passed by, and Izuku still had to quash down that niggling anger from time to time. He didn't ask Shinso about what had happened, and Shinso didn't tell. They just moved on, as if nothing happened at all. And that was probably for the best. If he asked Shinso about his quirk like he was dying to, then Shinso might ask him about his. Not to mention, if Shinso started trash talking his quirk, Izuku might just suplex him through the floor. Yeah, the anger was still definitely there, but it was manageable. It sat neatly compartmentalized next to all his other bits of burning rage behind a locked door, and it wouldn't do anyone any good to poke at it. No, pretending like nothing happened was for the best. Izuku had finally caught wind of an upcoming support gear dealing, and it was by pure stupid chance, too. He was rifling through the dumpster behind the hardware store, trying to find any bits or bobs that might be helpful, when he heard someone enter the alley. He didn't pay it much mind, but he definitely did when he started to actually listen to what they were saying. They were so stupid. He wasn't even being that quiet. Did they not hear him? Or did they just assume he was a cat and start yapping away about their top secret criminal activities? This was the hardware store. What the hell would a cat be after in this dumpster anyway? Whatever, thank Kami for idiots. He had to sit in the dumpster waiting for them to finish smoking or whatever the heck that was they were doing for over 20 minutes before he could creep out. He didn't catch a look at their faces and he didn't recognize their voices, but this information was too valuable to risk exposing himself for. So he waited patiently and didn't even peek out until he heard their footsteps recede and 5 minutes of silence had passed. The two men, he assumed, were long gone by that point, but he had already gotten all the information he needed. There was going to be a deal tonight with, quote, the supplier at 12 on block 24. And Ivy was going to be there. Eraser! They yelled as they climbed over the wall. They watched as he startled enough to drop the bit of food he had between his chopsticks over the edge of the roof and looked down with a frown before turning to them with an exasperated expression. I'm right here. What the hell are you screaming for? He asked as he shot them a dirty look. Information! I have information! They chirped, ignoring the glare entirely. He gestured with his empty chopsticks with a raised brow and waited for them to elaborate. I overheard some boneheads talking about a deal with the supplier that's going on tonight at 12 on block 24. They whisper shouted with a feral grin. Seriously, he asked. Yes, seriously. I was in an alley. They didn't know I was there, and they just started talking over a smoke. Either they're playing some 5D chess level mind games, and this is a trap, which I highly doubt, or we've actually got a lead, they exclaimed. Eraser actually smiled at that. He never smiled. Well, not never, but only when he was being a sadist, and that smile was creepy as hell, but this one looked genuine and soft. It was infectious. If Ivy wasn't already grinning from ear to ear, they would be now. Good work, kid, he praised before turning back to his dinner. Ivy literally skipped over to where their dinner was set on the ledge next to him, and he shook his head with a good-natured laugh. Don't get your hopes up too high. This might not lead us anywhere, he warned. Too late! Ivy shot back before they took their mask off and dug into their meal. The minutes ticked by as slow as molasses as their patrol went on. They stayed centralized around Block 24, but they still had a few hours to kill before the deal was set to go down. Eraser chewed them out for not warning him about this sooner so that he could bring the comms again, but it was too late for that now, so at 11:30 they split up and started circling the block looking for any sort of suspicious activity. At 11:56, Ivy saw a man with a briefcase enter an alley, so they shot a text off to Eraser and got closer. There were two men waiting for him under the awning of a garage. They got as close as they dared to on the lowest rooftop overlooking the area. The group wouldn't be able to see Ivy from where they were, but their voices echoed up the alley walls. It was perfect. It was the same two men from before. They recognized their voices. They'd seen one of them around town before, but they didn't know his name, and they had no clue who the other guy was. They also didn't recognize the supplier. Eraser settled down next to them just as the group had finished their pleasantries and got down to business. The supplier propped the case open on his forearm and opened it to face the two men. As he did, he looked around suspiciously like he was double-checking that they weren't being watched. Ivy would have laughed at the irony of if the man's eyes didn't lock onto them the moment he looked up. Both of them froze, unsure if the man had actually seen them. It should be impossible. They were barely peeking out between the ledge of the roof and a satellite dish, but even so, the man slapped the briefcase shut and pulled the other two guys' attention toward them as well. Shit. Neither of them hesitated after that. They both leapt out from their hiding spots and threw themselves down into the alley. One of the buyers started shooting sparks at them from his hands like they were finger guns, but Eraser canceled out his quirk, and Ivy made quick work of him. The other buyer was trying to run away, but Eraser sent out a loop of his capture scarf to grab him as Ivy went after the dealer. The world seemed to move in slow motion as the man opened the briefcase again, pulled out a gun, and pointed it straight at Ivy. Well, at both of them, since Eraser was directly behind them. Ivy was much closer, but not close enough, and they didn't have time to disarm the man before he fired. They shouted for Eraser to dodge because they had no clue what the gun was about to do, but they're not sure how much good that did because in a split second, their left arm, which was stretched toward the wall in an attempt to grab and pull themselves out of the way, was frozen solid to the brick. They tried to shift their weight to pull it free, but their feet were frozen to the ground as well. The dealer took that moment to book it down the alleyway from them. Ivy could only assume that Eraser had gotten caught in the freeze as well, and the buyer had either gotten away or been neutralized because they saw Eraser run past them down the alley after the dealer with only one boot on. He wouldn't have left them if the buyer was still a threat. They craned their neck around as much as they could, and sure enough, no one was there. Damn it. They whipped their head around looking for the first buyer that they had knocked out, but they were gone too. When did that happen? Damn it. They had to hope that Eraser caught at least one of them because they were well and truly stuck. They pulled out a knife to try and pick away at the ice, but it wasn't doing much, and every second that ticked by had them falling further and further into a panic. The exposed ring of skin between their jacket and glove was so cold that it felt like it was burning, and Kami, that was not helping. It felt like a scalding hot hand grasping his wrist, pinning him in place, and that was not bringing back pleasant memories. They were getting frantic, and they were liable to start stabbing themselves with the way they were trying to chip away the ice. Where the hell was Eraser? Their breath was becoming shallow as they thrashed and tried trying to dislodge something. Kami, anything! They heard uneven footsteps behind them, and they whipped around again only to find Eraser shuffling toward them with one boot because the other one was still frozen to the ground. Their panic must have been evident because he walked in a large circle until he was in front of them. Ivy, Ivy, you need to stop. You're going to dislocate your shoulder if you keep doing that, he warned as he slowly approached them with his hands up. They really tried to calm down, but their breath wasn't cooperating. Eraser stepped forward and firmly placed his hands on their shoulders, forcing their attention back onto him. Ivy, it's okay. I'm going to get you out of there, but you need to calm down. They stopped moving, but their breaths were still not filling their lungs properly. They were shallow and erratic. It was December. This wasn't going to melt, and Eraser was walking away. Why was he walking away? They couldn't find the words to ask, and their vision was starting to get spotty. Their wrist burned. Suddenly, Eraser was back and stilling their thrashing again. His mouth was moving. He was talking. Shit, he was talking to them. What did he say? They managed to force out a mumbled, "What?" So he repeated himself. I can break the ice. It's not going to melt out here. But if I do that, it might break your arm too. We can wait for someone to come melt this, or we can possibly be making another trip to Recovery Girl, he explained. When they looked down, they saw that what he was holding, what looked to be a broken off piece of railing from a fire escape. You have a thing for breaking my limbs with fire escapes, Eraser. They tried to joke, but it came out a stuttered mess. He snorted anyway. Do you want me to break it? He asked. My arm? No, not really. They poked. The ice, Ivy, he clarified as he rolled his eyes. They looked at the ice and the practically non-existent progress they'd made in chipping away at it, then looked at the long rusty piece of metal in Eraser's hand before nodding. He looked at them, studying their shaking form and uneven breaths before nodding back at them. He sent off a text to Tsukashi telling him to meet them there because they were going to need to make a report regardless of whether they also needed another ride to Chio's house. So if their arm was fine, the trip would still be fruitful. All right. Okay. This is an awful idea and Chio's going to kill me, he muttered under his breath as he stepped back and lined himself up for the swing. He made a few practice swings to make sure he didn't just whack Ivy's arm without breaking any of the ice, before asking them for final confirmation and giving a countdown before swinging the bar over his head and down onto the junction of ice and wall. There was a sickening crack that reminded him far too much of the sound of Ivy's leg breaking in half. But it wasn't accompanied by a scream this time. Their arm had been detached from the wall, but it was still encased in a large chunk of ice, and their feet were still rooted to the ground. Before he could ask if they felt anything break, they took their club of an arm and sent it crashing into their left foot. The ice splintered off their arm, and the ice holding their foot cracked enough for them to wrench their boot free. They immediately took out their baton and started wailing at their other foot. Right, okay, looks like they've got this under control. He took the metal bar and went over to break his own shoe out of the ice while Ivy attacked their foot with extreme force and prejudice. He was whacking his boot against the brick wall, trying to get the last bits of ice off of it, as he saw Tsukashi pull up to the mouth of the alley. Ivy, Tsukashi's here, he called back over his shoulder at the kid who was currently kicking their own feet, also trying to break off the last lingering bits of ice. I'm assuming your arm is fine? He asked to make sure. It would have been quite impressive if they did all that beating the shit out of ice with a broken arm. But honestly, this kid had done worse. He wouldn't put it past them. Yeah, it's fine, they confirmed. They still seemed a little shaken. Their tone was clipped, and there was no witty retort. But they weren't freaking out anymore, so he'd call that a win for now. The detective was out of his car and walking to meet them. His sock was wet, and he couldn't feel his toes. He imagined Ivy wasn't doing much better on that front. Get in the car and turn the heat on, he barked over to Tsukashi as he headed toward the car with Ivy in tow. The detective made a face at him for the demand, but listened regardless. I'm not getting in his car again, Eraser, Ivy called from behind him as they hustled to catch up to his much longer stride. He looked them up and down. They were shivering. All right, well, I am. You can freeze your ass off out here, he said as he opened up the passenger seat and closed the door behind him. He knew they hated being vulnerable in front of him, and they just had another panic attack. The last thing they were going to want is being coddled right now, and he knew their need for answers would outweigh their continued mild distrust for the detective. Sure enough, they were knocking on the back door as Shoto was turning the vents onto his feet and throwing his boot on the ground. Dude, you can't turn the heat on with your rancid wet toes in my car. What the hell? Tsukashi complained as Ivy got into the back seat. I will pour your coffee on your shoes if you turn that off, Shota threatened. He clearly saw that that wasn't an empty threat because he lowered his hand and left the vent on with a look of disgust as Ivy snorted at him from the back seat. Am I just here so you can warm your feet and laugh at me? He asked. No, we just broke up a support gear deal, Shota quipped back. The detective looked excited for a moment before remembering that they were both empty-handed. His expression fell quickly after that, and he scrubbed at his face with his hands. What happened? He groaned. They had a freeze ray and stuck Ivy to the wall and ground, as well as getting one of my feet. I pursued the dealer after I got my foot free, but they were gone. The buyers got away in the commotion as well, he explained curtly. Well, did you get a good look at them? Buyers or seller? I got a good look of one of the buyers, but not the seller. Ivy, did you recognize any of them? He asked, turning around in his seat to face them. Yeah, at least one of the buyers is a local, but I don't know his name. I can find that out by tomorrow, though. Maybe his buddy, too. But I doubt they're gonna stick around their usual haunts, waiting for you to pick them up. They know we saw them, they grumbled. Great, so I really did come up here, just so you could warm your feet, Tsukashi complained. Did you get a good look at the seller, Ivy? Uh, yeah, a little too good, they replied with a grimace. They were still shivering. Tsukashi looked so tired at that response. How the hell are we supposed to sit you down with a sketch artist? He groaned into his hands again. He looked back at Ivy, who was fidgeting uncomfortably, like they wanted to say something, but wasn't sure if they should or not. He gave them a minute to percolate while the detective rested his head in his hands on the steering wheel. Do you have a paper and pencil or a pen, I guess, but preferably a pencil? They finally asked. The detective sat up at that and took a second to think. Yeah, I got paper. Eraser, open the glove box. There should be a notepad in there. Might have a pencil tucked into the spiral, he prompted. He found the notepad, but not the pencil. Luckily, it had just fallen out and onto the bottom of the glove box. He passed both of them back to the kid through the bar separating the front and back of the vehicle. Ivy took them and scooted up with their back against the door and their legs propped up in front of them and set the book down on their thighs before starting to scribble away at it. Tsukashi and him shared a glance, but decided not to question it. Shoto was enjoying the heat, and he was sure Tsukashi wasn't in a race to get back to the office and sit in front of a computer screen, so he sat back and rested his eyes. He was roused from his light dozing by the sound of the notepad thunking down onto the center console. Sukashi looked like he was responding to an email on his phone, so he picked it up and took a look at it. The first page had a pretty detailed drawing of the man. It was well done, and it had labels and descriptions pointing to various spots. It listed his approximate height and weight as well as Ivy's best guess of his hair and eye color. The next page and a half was filled with writing about the encounter and their theories about what the man's quirk could be in the order of how likely Ivy thought they were. Holy shit! Did he actually fall asleep? He checked the time, but no. It had only been a little over 15 minutes. He must have looked as shocked as he felt because the detective was asking what he was looking at and grabbing the book out of his hands. He watched as Sukashi's eyes went wide at the first page, and his look of bewilderment only increased as he read through the rest. It's been 18 minutes, Ivy. How did you even write all of this legibly in that amount of time? Sukashi asked as he finished reading the last of it. Ivy looked uncomfortably back and forth between the two of them and shrugged. I guess I write fast. I don't know. Kami, okay, well, if you ever want a job as a sketch artist or profiler, you've got my number, he said with a laugh as he flipped through the pages again. Ivy just looked even more uncomfortable at that. I tried my best. You don't have to be such an ass about it, they mumbled as they crossed their arms over their chest and threw the pencil at him through the bars. The detective seemed too wrapped up in going over the commentary again to hear Ivy's complaint. He scrunched his nose up when the pencil hit him, but he just picked it up and tucked it back into the spiral. Kid, I don't think he was joking. This is really good, Shota clarified. The detective finally looked up at that to see Ivy's furrowed brow and crossed arms in the back seat. He glanced at Shota, trying to figure out what he missed before speaking. No, Ivy, I wasn't kidding. This is really helpful. It doesn't get much better than this unless you manage to snag his ID. The kid looked less offended, but no less uncomfortable at the clarification. The detective seemed to have picked up on that, though, because he gave them an out. All right, I should get this back to the station and see what I can do. I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Shota frowned at that. His sock was still wet, but he figured he couldn't just stay in the detective's car all night anyway. His boots were leather, so at least the inside wouldn't be wet, but wearing leather boots without a sock was going to give him blisters. Great. That was something to look forward to. Ivy was already out of the car, and once he finished adjusting his boot, he bid the detective farewell and joined them. Are your clothes wet? He asked. They had stopped shivering in the car, but if their jacket was wet, that warmth wouldn't last long in the biting cold winter winds. They went to put a hand on their arm to see if it was wet, but they were wearing gloves. He just scoffed and shook his head at them and grabbed their arm himself. It's a bit damp. Do you have another layer on under that, or are you so cold that you can't feel it? I've got another layer. I'm fine, they clarified as they rolled their eyes at him. With a sigh, he looped his wet sock to his belt. Maybe it would dry out there? No, it was just going to freeze. He resigned himself to his fate and nodded at Ivy to continue their patrol. End of chapter.